Hello, I'm going to take you through the story of Raheny from the late 17th century right up to the year 2000. As a geographer, my focus is on how humans interact with and shape the landscape. So I'm going to largely build this story of Raheny using a sequence of maps, which we can use to tell the story of the evolving landscape and the agents of change, those people and organizations who helped to reshape that landscape over the centuries. One of the other things I'll hone in on is what you can see on this first slide, those four areas marked in blue, which are the four churches of Raheny. Typically, it's large public buildings like churches that make the greatest mark on the landscape, together with the residences of the wealthy and so on. These tend to last the longest as well. Now, before we move forward, I'd just like to draw your attention to the fact that the boundaries that we will sometimes be referring to are the civil parish. So here it is marked on the present day map, but the civil parish boundaries might look somewhat different from the Raheny as it appears in your own head or in your own thinking of what Raheny should be. So just to bear in mind that sometimes when we refer to population figures, for example, in earlier times, we're talking about those in relation to the civil parish. So our first map or sequence of maps goes back to the middle of the 17th century. By this time, there had been a church located at the heart of the village for centuries. We've seen references from the 12th century to a chapel, at least, on that location. So we're going to come to Raheny at a time when there was one church. Now, the series of maps that we're going to look at is part of a big project that was undertaken at a time of great upheaval in Ireland. So the 17th century was a time of war, rebellion, Cromwell, and all sorts of unpleasantness across Ireland. And one of the outcomes of this was a decision to take land away from some people and give it to other people. So the Down Survey, these maps that we're going to see are from something called the Down Survey, which was an attempt to record all of that land that was going to be removed. So if we think about any map, it's very important that we understand the purpose for which it was made, because that helps us to understand what information is provided and maybe what's omitted from it. So here we are for the County of Dublin in the Down Survey, which was taken between 1656 and 58. And we're going to hone in on that little area that's marked in blue. And here we have a locality that should hopefully be familiar. You can see Clontarf is marked, moving out along the coast towards Howth. We have familiar names like Finglas, Artane, Coolock, Kilbarrack, Baldoyle, we can probably guess at. But actually on this map, we have no sign of the name Raheny at all. However, when we zoom in a little bit closer, this is a map of the barony of the County of Dublin, so of Coolock in the County of Dublin. So this is a sort of, if we like, zooming in a little bit closer, different set of maps. And these are really focusing on the land that was being given up or taken away. So we're going to, again, zoom in on this area that's marked in green. And when we do so, we'll see a lot of the land has very little detail. It's just white. And this is the land that's owned by the Lord of Howth. Because he was getting to keep his land, there was no need to record it in any great detail. What we do have this area ringed in red with numbers 55, 56, and then there's a little sort of a rectangle as well. These represent land that is going to be taken away from some people, and therefore we have a little bit more information about it. When we look in again further, take another zoom a bit closer to the parishes, we can see that Raheny or Raheny parish is mentioned. We have the church is clearly marked, and then we have this land that is being removed or forfeited. Just to notice that the north point on this map isn't where it would be in a modern day map, typical modern map. So it's actually pointing to the right. So we're looking kind of sideways onto the area of Raheny. And when we move in and look at Talbot's land, these numbers 55 and 56, what we're going to see is that the terriers, which are the written annotations associated with the map, they tell us a little bit about this land that's being taken away. So what we read is that the parish of Raheny or Raheny, it's telling us exactly where it is, where its boundaries are. It's saying that the soil is arable, meadow, and pasture. And the forfeited land just has two parcels. One is Talbot's farm, the other is Plunkett's land. And on Talbot's land, we have one thatched house and two cabins. So we can see a little bit more detail underneath about the 86 acres of Talbot's farm and another portion, which is 21 acres, and Plunkett's land is a very small part. It's only 1 acre or so. A little bit earlier than the Down survey, we had the civil survey, which was the first attempt to record this information, except the difference here was that there was no maps associated with it. But what we do know from this, it was trying to determine the value of each townland based on the records, the original owners. What it does do is it fleshes out our understanding of what Raheny would have been like at this time. So the parish as a whole contained 479 acres. Most of it was in arable. We know that Talbot's farm then had 106 acres, again, mostly arable. It had a large thatched farmhouse and 3 cottages. Thomas Plunkett's land was bordering the church and the river. We learned from the civil survey. Lord Baron of Howth had 340 acres. So he was the major landowner in Raheny at this time. And what's interesting about the description from the civil survey is that it tells us there were 2 good thatched houses, several small cottages, as well as 1 watermill, 1 windmill, and the walls of a decayed church. So this is our church, hopefully, we think. And the last owner that's mentioned in the civil survey was 30 acres of church lands. So this belonged to Christ Church and was a hangover from much earlier periods. So our early picture is one of agricultural land with a smattering of houses, a watermill, a windmill, and a church. Now that windmill was on a hill, so it was clearly a landmark. And here, almost a century later, in Gibson's map of Dublin Bay, we can see it marked. This is a view looking in from the sea, and clearly this windmill on a hill was a landmark. As we jump forward in time, the level of detail we have improves greatly, and that's partly because of improved cartographic techniques, but also because of the purposes for which the maps were being produced. So the next map of our village is this extract from John Roke's 1760 map of County Dublin. And this includes far more detail than the Down survey, which of course was largely concerned with the details of confiscated land. So we get much more of a sense of the physical features of the landscape and also some of the human imprint on it. So there's a few things that we can note here. First of all, we see the name Raheny quite clearly to cover the general area, and it's written in quite large letters. Similarly, we have Coolock, Artane, Killester, Kilbarrack, all in reasonably large writing. We also have some names that are largely lost in the present day, like Shillinglass, which also appeared in the Down survey. Here it is again, close to Coolock. We also have water courses. So if we look along the eastern side of our map, and they're shaded as well to suggest the slopes or the contours, which give an impression of these being in river valleys. And we can also see the raised beach, the post-glacial raised beach along the coast. But the 3 important water courses that are seen here, the first one, as we move from north to south, rises near the quarry, and it flows to the sea just north of Fox's Lane. And that may be the stream that marked the northern boundary of Dublin Corporation's jurisdiction. The second one then is the Santry River, the one which flows through the village, much as it does today, to a location marked as Black Bush. And the third is what we know as the Nanakan River, the river which flows through the modern day St. Anne's Park. We also have a number of important routeways. So Fox Lane, here underlined in yellow, is very prominently marked. And that is the main route north from the village. going towards Howth, and it's taking something of a circuitous route. Notice the line of the road through Raheny. So the main approach to the church, and there is only one church from the city, would have been roughly down present-day Watermill Lane and then up the modern-day Main Street. And you can see the bridge going across the Santry River. We also have a lot of evidence of production. So we have the quarry, which later became a tip and is now Edenmore Park. We have the windmill opposite it, roughly where the St. Francis Hospice and the Capuchins are today. And that was used to grind corn for quite a long time. And a lot of it went later on to Sweetman's, the brewers who lived locally. We have a stone wharf near the end of Watermill Lane. But there's also some signs of change because we have the disused mill on the Santry River. That's presumably a watermill that gave Watermill Road its name. And we have an old windmill just south of the main road from Dublin. We have, of course, the church. It's just called the church. It's not attributed to any particular saint. And there's a cluster of buildings there forming the village core. There are some individual residences with gardens. So if you look closely, you'll see sort of formal laid out squares of gardens. None of them are named on the map apart from the Fox on Fox Lane. And most clearly we can see the site of the present day St. Joseph's Hospital, because we know this was known at the time as Violet Hill. It had been built about 1730, so it was still relatively new, but it was clearly a big, well-established house. Close to the village centre is the location which would have been Raheny House, later known as Rathmore, also with fine gardens. And Manor House appears to be there on the map, but it's got a much, much smaller footprint. There's nothing on the site of what, possibly nothing, or maybe something very small on the site of what would become St. Anne's. So this is a time when Raheny was very much out in the countryside, very rural, agricultural, a lot of farming activity and associated activities. So the quarry, that lime, could have been used to spread on the land. It could also have been used for construction purposes as well. Raheny then was very much like other villages in the hinterland of Dublin in the mid-18th century. It's well outside the city. It's an agricultural area. It has some fine houses dotting the landscape, but really the mud cabins where the majority of the population would have lived, they didn't appear on maps, and ultimately they simply melted back into the landscape over time. So we have very little record of those. But to add a little bit more to the picture, I'd like to show you a very different kind of a map. This is one of a series of over 280 maps produced by George Taylor and Andrew Skinner in what might be termed the first road map of Ireland. So this provided detail of all different routes, and our route, of course, is the road from Dublin to Howth. And the maps are quite high quality. They certainly represent distance correctly, and a lot of the physical landscape is shown correctly. And it also provides us with lists of large houses and the owners' names. Now, this map is quite interesting because in order to finance such a large undertaking, the cartographers needed funding in the form of subscriptions from noblemen and gentlemen. And these individuals would receive a copy of the book, and they'd also see their name in print. And so the areas that didn't contain a gentleman's residence or seat aren't as well depicted, and some native Irish settlements just aren't shown at all. So they raised the money from the various subscribers, and there's a list at the end of the subscribers. And as you'll see from the reproduction I have here, those people marked with an asterisk aren't subscribers. So it was sort of an element of naming and shaming involved. But one of the people who did subscribe is our local resident, Samuel Dick. And we'll come back to him in a moment, because he was important, and we'll see the role of powerful individuals as agents of change in the landscape. But let's have a look at Taylor and Skinner's map. This is what it would look like turned on its side so that we can see a sort of a more familiar view of Dublin. And this is the road to Howth. So Dublin to Howth, and the Irish miles and English miles are given in an appendix as well. So when we zoom in on this area, and we're going to turn it over so that we can see the writing, what we see is moving from the bottom. We can see Marino and the Earl of Charlemont's land clearly marked. We can see Clontarf. We can see lots of names of individuals who probably subscribed to the map. And one of these is Mr. Dick, marked in yellow. So that's Violet Hill, the house that we previously mentioned. Raheny itself isn't very clearly marked. We have a few dots to represent the village. You can also see that kink in the road, that kind of curious shape of the road that we mentioned previously. Now, the role of powerful individuals has been a feature of the development of Raheny from very early times. And these individuals or agents of change are a feature across Ireland at this time. In the 18th century, improving landlords were innovative in terms of agriculture, in terms of improving the landscape, in terms of looking after the welfare of their tenants. The Royal Dublin Society was actively trying to encourage improvements on the land. Individual estate owners were creating new villages or modifying existing villages. And this is sort of the context in which we see Mr. Dick at work in Raheny. So some of the most prominent and picturesque elements of present-day Raheny date back to two individuals who were very active in promoting and improving the village. First are Mr. Dick, and secondly, the Guinness family, especially Lord Ardilaun. So we've seen the line of the road through Raheny, we've seen the names of the landowners, and Samuel Dick is our prominent agent of change at this period. So he was a linen merchant. He came to live in Violet Hill in about 1773. He was a very successful businessman, very active in public life, at one stage governor of the Bank of Ireland. And in 1787, he paid for the construction of the two-storey schoolhouse, which was on land at the edge of the churchyard and which is still there today. It's the oldest building that's in use in Raheny in the present day. It cost £150, which was a very substantial sum. And a few years later, in 1790, he built some cottages for workers on his estate. And those cottages we know as the Crescent. This was a former potato garden. He built these very pretty cottages for his workers, but of course they were paying rent for those cottages. And that rent he left in trust in his will to pay the salary of the schoolmaster of his charity school. So any money left over then would be used to clothe the children of such parents as are most in want of it in the parish. So when he died, his bequest was used to support the school, and indeed it continues to support the successor of the school, which is Springdale School in Raheny. So this is the oldest actively used building in the village, now a restaurant, of course, and the Crescent. And these buildings help to give Raheny its distinctive character. So we've seen that a wealthy and interested individual like Samuel Dick could be a major agent of change in the landscape of Raheny, but our next agent of change is rather different. Because these images symbolize the decision to make Howth the location for the harbour for the mail packet. So all of the post, all the communications going from Dublin to London was going to go via Howth. And as a result, the Howth Road needed to be widened and made suitable for mail coaches like the one on the right. So famous engineer Thomas Telford was responsible for the new Howth Road. And this extended from Howth Harbour right to the General Post Office. And we can see the milestones along the way like this one. It was, if you like, Dublin's first national road. It was intended to make communications between Dublin and London easier. And in fact, sometimes it was referred to as the Dublin and London Road for this reason. So it was linking Dublin to London. Now, interestingly, much later, Weston St. John Joyce, writing about the apparently disproportionate scale of the Howth Road at the time, remarked that this road which in width and mode of construction presents the appearance of a great highway, is strangely out of proportion to its actual importance as a thoroughfare. So it was leading to what was really just a small fishing village, but it had been constructed in a very elaborate way to mark the importance of Howth as this very important port for government businesses and government dispatches going through here. Now, one of the impacts of building that new road was to reshape the section of the Howth Road beside Raheny. And William Duncan's map from 1821 is particularly good at giving an impression of the dramatic change which occurred to the shape of the village. So there's a much more direct approach from the Dublin side, from the left-hand side, which cuts out the kink, or at least makes it much less important, because now we can go in a much straighter fashion, rather than having to go down Watermill Lane and back up Main Street. And further north, as we go towards Howth, the new line of the road cut away from Fox's Lane. So that was quite steep going down to the sea. So they have a much gentler angle, and that lost its prominence. So Fox's Lane becomes less important. So the road created a much more direct routeway. As it was being made, it also interfered with the remains of the Rath at the centre of the village. We can see the watercourses very clearly on this map as well, and we can also see glebe lands belonging to the church in evidence as well. At almost the same time that this map was being produced, a visitor to Ireland called Thomas Cromwell described visiting this area and seeing this new roadway. And he's using the modern spelling, we'll see Raheny here, but he also makes a distinction between two different locales, two different locations. He mentions Raheny being known as Raheny in the country, to distinguish it from Raheny on the Strand, the latter being a pleasant little village on the Bay of Dublin. So there were sort of two different settlements in quite close proximity, the main village, but then also this subsidiary Raheny on the Strand, which may perhaps have looked something like this, so close to the sea. And this is an image from the National Library of Ireland. So this here from 1837 is our last map before the second great transport innovation, which is the coming of the railway, which is another major agent of change. But here in Lewis's topographical dictionary, we get some information about what Raheny was like in the 1830s. And also from the 1830s, we get some statistics, some numbers about the kinds of numbers of people who were living in the area. So around 500 people in 1821, about 600 in 1831. That's for the entire parish, not just the village, but those several hundred acres around the village. When the railway came to Raheny, and it is depicted on this first edition Ordnance Survey map, it was a very dramatic intervention. So the Dublin and Drogheda Railway Company dramatically imposed this new feature on the landscape. It required a huge amount of works, including major cuttings and quarrying, diverting water courses, and it also impacted on the decisions of local landowners. For example, a new infant school was provided on land which had been cut off, a little corner of a field really that had been cut off by the railway, and that's the school on Station Road today. In the longer term, the arrival of the railway was going to change the relationship between this country village and the city of Dublin. And of course, in the late 20th century, with the arrival of more frequent rail connections, the arrival of the DART would greatly facilitate workers who were living here and moving to the city. So the Dublin to Drogheda Railway opened in 1844. It was designed by John McNeill, who incidentally had worked with Thomas Telford. He had been his assistant. He was our man who built the new road. The first sod for the railway was turned at Raheny, and the opening celebrations for the railway took place at what is now St. Joseph's Hospital, which is marked on this map as Edenmore, and of course, which had been Violet Hill, home of Samuel Dick. It seems from this map that the railway wasn't yet complete, and there's a gap. I don't know if you can see the line of the railway is incomplete. Reputedly, this is due to a dispute with the person who owned Edenmore at that time, who didn't want the railway to go through his land. So the solution was that the Dublin and Drogheda Railway Company purchased Edenmore, and that was why they had their celebrations in the house and grounds after the opening of the railway. And of course, the guest of honour was Daniel O'Connell. The survey also, so here is the incomplete railway line just close up, the house now known as Edenmore House, and that new infant school, which you can kind of see is in a triangle of land which probably belonged previously to a much bigger field. Also on this first edition sheet, we can see the centre of the village, and it also includes a different school, a second school. So we can see the schoolhouse just around just below the graveyard in the centre of the village. That's Dick's School, but we also have a national school. So this map is from the 1830s, but the school here is known as Sweetman's School. So we've mentioned important local residences, and this is thanks to William or Billy Sweetman, who was a brewer and a member of a prominent Catholic family who had a long association with the area. And he paid for the first Catholic school in 1820, which was originally a girls' school only, but later took in boys as well. And he lived in the house. So this is, he lived in Raheny House, later Rathmore, which is just to the north. You can see it on the map also. So that this was almost opposite the gates of his own house. It became a national school in 1835, and it stayed at this location until the 1870s. So these are some of the main features of the village. Lewis's Topographical Dictionary in 1837, so roughly the same time as this map, gives us a snapshot of some of the features of Raheny. It describes the fact that it's 4 miles northeast of the post office, about 600 people, gives us a little bit of history, tells us it's good quality, good agricultural activities going on. It mentions the limestone quarry. It talks about some of the main houses and their residents. And it also mentions that there's a police barracks there, and the church, that our first church, our only church still in Raheny at this point, a small plain edifice rebuilt about the year 1609. So that is the Church of Ireland church at the centre of the village. If you were a Catholic living in Raheny in the 1830s, you wouldn't have been able to attend a church service in Raheny. You'd have to go maybe towards Annesley Bridge direction to Fairview, or up towards Coolock to church there. Okay, one thing that isn't mentioned in that topographical dictionary is one of the new major influences on the area, which had recently arrived. And I'm referring here to the Guinness family, and they first acquired land in the area in 1835. This was Benjamin Lee Guinness and his brother Arthur Lee, who were grandsons of the founder of the brewery. They acquired Thornhill with its 50 acres of land at Blackbush or Heronstown, and they don't appear in our entry because the land was actually in Clontarf, the civil parish of Clontarf. So it was the other side of the Nanakan River. Here we can see it on the map, all right, but it's not mentioned as being part of Raheny because what they had at that time was actually in Clontarf. We don't have time to talk about this, but Joan Sharkey's excellent work gives plenty of detail. Now, Benjamin Lee Guinness undertook some landscaping. He built a new house, which partly incorporated the previous house of Thornhill, and he named it St. Anne's. So by the middle of the century, the estate was about 85 acres, and some was in Clontarf and some was in Raheny. He was a very benevolent individual as well as an excellent businessman. You can learn more about him in the Raheny Historical Society or Heritage Society's wonderful book, Raheny Footprints, if you'd like to know more. When he died in 1868, his estate was valued at over £1 million. So in 1868, over £1 million. That was a vast sum of money. Guinness's was the biggest porter brewery in the world. So with that kind of money, a lot could be achieved in the right hands. So this was described, the village was being described at this time as a picturesquely situated little village with the remains of the Rath still traceable opposite the church, although vastly curtailed of its fair proportions. The church, this is Dalton describing it as a plain structure in good repair, standing on rising ground. So as well as the cartographic evidence and the topographical dictionary, we are fortunate also to have a very interesting painting of Raheny from the middle of the 19th century. And this painting is by Edward McFarland, and it's part of a series of drawings in a book which has been digitized by the National Library of Ireland, so you can have a look. And the view is from the Watermill roadside. We can see the bridge over the Santry River. We can see the height and the prominence of the centre of the village. And you can see the church there at the centre with its double bell turret, the old St. Assam's Church, which of course would have still been in use at this point. So right through till now, to the middle of the 19th century, Raheny is still very much a rural village. It has some big houses in the vicinity, but very much unchanged, still very agricultural, as it had been when we started our story 2 centuries previously. One of the things that has changed, and this isn't something that we actually see on the maps, is the nature of the occupiers of the big houses that stood on the landscape. So we mentioned the Catholic Sweetman family already, but more generally, what's happening across Irish societies is a shift in the balance of power, particularly after Catholic emancipation and the rise of Catholic merchant class, business families. So we will come back to the Guinness family in a little while, but I just want to mention a little bit about these Catholic families. And one of these is Richard Kelly, who was an occupant of Manor House. And this is the house which previously stood where the convent and school now stand. And he lived here from about 1848 until his death. He was an extremely wealthy merchant. He was a member of the Catholic elite, a personal friend of Daniel O'Connell. He contributed to the building of Clonliffe College. And for our story, his importance lies in the fact that he was very actively involved in the church building committee for the Roman Catholic Church. So our second church, which is in the heart of the village and just opposite the ruined church that we've been talking about up till now, is St. Assam's Catholic Church. And this is the first Catholic church in the village for more than 300 years. So remember, up till now, Catholics have to walk to Coolock or Clontarf for services. But now, in the 1860s, the strength of the Catholic elite and the wealth and so on makes it possible to construct a church here. It was designed by a very well-known ecclesiastical architect, Patrick Byrne. The ground, the land on which it was built, was presented by a man called Patrick Moore, also Catholic. He was a railway contractor and he had bought Edenmore House in 1851. So this was land associated with Edenmore House, previously Violet Hill, where Samuel Dick had lived. So Patrick Byrne gives the land. Our friend Richard Kelly is very actively involved in the construction, and there are others too. It costs £3,500 at the time to build, and was actually supported not just by local Roman Catholic families, but also subscribers were members of the Protestant community as well. It was opened by Archbishop Cullen, later Cardinal Cullen, in 1864, and there's a very fine stained glass window in memory of Richard Kelly. Also in this time period, one of the changes we see to the village in the 1870s is some improvement in education. So the infant school, which had been built in the 1830s up on Station Road, was replaced by a new building, and this is it. You'll know it today, the Montessori School, and in the interim, actually, it had another life. It was occupied for a while by Scoil Nasson rather, the Gael Skull, which was founded in 1969, but that's jumping a little bit forward in time. So the infant school was replaced with a new building, a better, bigger building. And the national school, Sweetman School, which had been located in the centre of the village, moved to a new site, which is sort of behind the church. So it was part of the chapel lands. And this is in 1875. So there are two sort of big changes that take place as well to public buildings. Meanwhile, we've previously mentioned the St. Anne's estate and its influence, but this really comes to the fore with the influence of Arthur Edward Guinness, who later is named Lord Ardilaun. He was the eldest son of Benjamin Lee Guinness, and he was born here at St. Anne's, so he was a local boy. And he inherited this estate along with Ashford Castle and an equal share in the brewery with his brother Edward Cecil when the father died in 1868. And remember that estate, that vast wealth that Benjamin Lee Guinness left in his will. So it was Arthur Edward Guinness with his wife Olive who really massively expanded St. Anne's estate in the 1870s. He leased 277 acres from the Earl of Howth. He acquired Sybil Hill and Maryville. And by the time he was finished with it, St. Anne's was almost 500 acres in extent, so far, far larger estate than it had been. He remodeled the house over about 7 years. Initially, he had James Franklin Fuller as his architect, later George Ashland. And it was described as the most palatial house built in Ireland in the second half of the 19th century. And although this isn't a great photograph, I've selected it because it shows the start of the famous mile-long avenue with its holm oaks, which was also a creation of this time period. With his enormous wealth, Arthur Edward Guinness could afford to retire from the brewery and devote himself to public life and to philanthropy. One of his acts was to open St. Stephen's Green as a public park. But if we just focus on his role in Raheny, this was also very substantial. He was actively involved in the Church of Ireland. And he paid for renovations to Dick's School and to the Crescent. He also contributed to the new infant school that we saw from 1875. Now, like many landlords, he also built housing for workers on his estate. So in Raheny Village, some of the houses on Watermill Road were estate cottages. He was also client for a new post office designed by James Franklin Fuller and for the rebuilding of Raheny Cottage. But most importantly for our story, Lord Ardilaun undertook the sole cost of the new parish church, the new Church of Ireland church, which is the third church we'll talk about today. Oh, just to mention that there were other workers' cottages built in the 19th century, not by Lord Ardilaun, some by the Rural District Council. But we're turning to the parish church, the Church of All Saints, which was designed by George Coppinger Ashland and built between 1885 and 1890. And this new parish church, it wasn't really any larger than the old one. It seats about 120 people, built by Collin Brothers, the tower and spire constructed by Sharps of Great Brunswick Street, a fabulous mosaic floor by Oppenheimer of Manchester, and it cost an enormous amount of money. The estimated cost originally maybe 5,600, then up to 9,000, but eventually maybe as much as £20,000. And the church was finally dedicated in 1889. But this magnificent church is one of the great beauties of Raheny and is thanks to the benevolence and generosity of Lord Ardilaun. Now we know that even though this new church was the new place of worship for the Church of Ireland community, Lord Ardilaun maintained a keen interest in the old church, and he wanted to keep it and the graveyard in a tidy condition. But it was very expensive to maintain a disused building, and particularly the roof started to decay. And after a very severe gale in 1919, it became apparent that the roof was in danger of collapsing. So it was decided eventually to take down the walls of the building to about 3 feet in height, to leave the east gable standing, and then to move some of the mural slabs and date stones into this reformed building. And the graveyard also then was closed for further buildings because it was overcrowded, apart from a few family plots to which people had existing claims. So this is why the church came to be as it is today. So for more than 100 years, it has had no roof, and that was for practical reasons. In many ways, though, despite the fact that it had 2 new churches, improved schooling facilities, and so on, Raheny seemed almost unchanging in its overall character. As late as 1901, the population was just 432 people in the entire civil parish. So in 1901, it was actually had a smaller population than it had in the 1820s. And this photograph, taken by Clifton Johnson, an American visitor to Ireland, appears in his book, The Isle of the Shamrock, which describes his visit to Miss Barlow, a well-known writer and poet who lived in the cottage, also known as Ballyhoy, now the nursing home, Raheny Nursing Home. But when he visited Raheny, he explained that he saw this straggling little hamlet with tree-dotted fields around it. It had 2 inns, 2 churches, 2 schoolhouses, 1 little shop. And the most notable thing that he recalled from the day he visited was the row of men near the chief inn, the Manhattan, standing or sitting along the wall of a house. And they were laborers waiting to be hired, so agricultural laborers waiting to be hired. He also tells us a little bit about the kind of accommodation. So either you had the homes of the gentlefolk, the well-to-do people with lawns and shrubbery, and we can just about on the right-hand side of that picture see the gate to Raheny House, or Rathmore, Sweetman's house, shut away from the gaze of the passers-by with high stone walls. Or we have the barren little cottages of the peasantry, as he describes them. And these little cottages didn't have any running water, of course. They had to draw water either from the stream or from a pump. And the most frequent vehicles on the street at this time were donkey carts. So that description, and this is the view from which that photograph, that previous photograph was taken, this description broadly coincides with the new Ordnance Survey at the scale of 25 inches to 1 mile, which we'll see in a moment, which was surveyed in 1907. But this is the last time that we're going to see such a rural landscape. Because the last sequence of the maps and the last sort of section of this talk is going to talk about the dramatic changes during the 20th century. So we've already mentioned that in 1901, the population of the entire civil parish was 432. But in 1981, the population of the same area was over 16,000. So obviously very, very big population growth in the Raheny area in the later 20th century, which we're about to see. But going back to the early 20th century, the Ordnance Survey sheet shows us a village which is very much unchanged in many ways from the 1830s first edition Ordnance Survey map. We can see the barracks, the smithy, some cottages, the post office, the schools, graveyard, courthouse, dispensary, but really, and the station, but really a very tranquil rural landscape still, which was pretty much the same as it was in the 1930s. So it's still very much a rural district, the village with its houses, the churches, 2 pubs, a dispensary, the schools, the barracks, the railway station, set in the countryside. The biggest changes, I suppose, are the addition of these houses, Raheny Gardens at the edge of the village, and a little bit of ribbon development in the 1930s along the Howth Road, so some housing built. So we have the returning soldiers and sailors from the First World War being given houses by the Soldiers and Sailors Land Trust, and we have the sort of ribbon development, some of it very modern in style, the flat-roofed houses, but also some all-electric housing at Ennifert Park on the Howth Road. And this name, Ennifert, is quite interesting. I don't know who coined it, but it's very clearly another way of translating Raheny, the fort of Éine, Ennifert, or Ennifert, as we see here in this advertisement. But really, there's very little happening up until the Second World War. It's still very much a rural village, and the most profound changes to the landscape are going to happen after the Second World War. There is a little bit of improvement. We see some of improvements, water main provided in 1939. But development in Raheny and really right across the north side of Dublin was limited in the 20s and the 30s, apart from this small amount of ribbon development. And it's going to open up dramatically for a rather unglamorous reason, which is new sewer. So the fact that a very large sewer was going to be provided, the new North Dublin main drainage system, which would open up vast tracts of land relatively close to the city for housing development. So we will also see a new routeway, the James Larkin Road, opening in 1949 along the former route of the tram to Howth. But the most significant reason for the new development is this sewer that makes things possible. It should also be mentioned at this point that the key agents of change in the development after the Second World War were the Dublin Corporation and private developers. And Dublin Corporation begin to become active really with the acquisition of St. Anne's estate. So after the death of Lord Ardilaun and his wife, the estate passed to a nephew. So they were childless. It passed to their nephew, who had been a bishop of Meath. He wasn't very comfortable living in this vast and very expensive house to run. And he decided that he wanted to sell it. It didn't sell immediately. So he first put it up for sale in 1932. It didn't sell. And there was a lot of discussion about what should be done with the estate. And Dublin Corporation was interested in the possibility of acquiring this vast tract of land for use for housing. Dublin was still in the grip of enormous housing crisis, the tenement crisis, which had been ongoing for quite some time. This seemed like a great opportunity to acquire land and to build a substantial number of houses. In the early days, they were talking about thousands of houses on the estate, maybe 3,000 houses. And there's quite a lot of discussion about what should and could be built on the site. The house, sadly, as we know, was destroyed by fire at Christmas time in 1943. The estate was ultimately acquired by the corporation in the late 30s. There was some disputes around various elements, but anyway, it was available then, and the discussion continued after the Second World War about what to do and how much of it should be built upon. If we look at a map from the late 1940s, we can see that there's still an awful lot of open land between Artane, Killester, Coolock and Raheny. And the purple line on this map represents the city boundaries. Now, what maps of this period show us, and we're going to see three successive maps of this area, is a ring of expansion outwards from the city. So over time, we're going to see development happening first along the major routeways, and then the land in between being filled in later. And ultimately, by the late 60s, we see a huge continuous belt of development right through across the northern edge of the city, from Finglas in the west through Santry, Raheny, Cabarrick, and along the coast to Sutton. So Dublin Corporation is going to be active in this development, so too are private developers. So the St. Anne's estate had been acquired. One of the important elements to mention is that in 1941, Sir Patrick Abercrombie, famous planner, produced a plan for the city, and he argued strongly that St. Anne's would be an ideal regional scale park. He thought as well that the mansion and the gardens might be useful as a folk museum. And there were later suggestions too as to what use the house might be put. But what's important really is this mention of the idea of a park, because that really, that intervention was very important in ending this discussion about using the entire area for housing. Okay, so there was a lot of public disquiet about what might be done, but by 1952, the proposals for corporation housing had been whittled down to about 600 better quality 5-roomed houses for tenant purchase, and about 60 private houses and some residential shops. So this photograph shows the house still standing, but with no roof, as you can see. But up in the top left-hand corner, we can see some of the new housing of St. Anne's estate. By the early 1950s then, what we're seeing is the corporation actively building housing at St. Anne's and other developers coming in and building in the area, thanks to the new drainage scheme. So in this series of advertisements from 1953, we can see the slogan, "Let's live on the north side, tillage to village in 10 years. So this remarkable scale of development, and advertisements then for various estates in the locality. Egan's Garden Estate, St. Assam's Avenue, beautiful residential area and convenient to shops, churches, schools and railway station. Jack Belton had acquired the former glebe house, the rectory, and some of its land in 1950. He had been Lord Mayor of Dublin in 1950, and he started to build at Ennifert Park. And some of these advertisements, you'll notice, have mentioned quite low deposits and also corporation loans available. So a lot of the people who came out, there were middle class people who bought these houses, but they were availing of special mortgages from Dublin Corporation. So although they were private houses, they were being supported by the corporation. Here's another example from Ennifert Park, and we can see there was a government grant available and corporation loan and a supplemental grant for those who qualified. So these made the houses affordable, or brought them within reach of a lot of people. Some of those people might even have been able to afford a motor car. Some of the houses have garages and some have space for garages. And there's new garages, 2 garages in Raheny by the 1950s. So here we can see some of the corporation type housing. And of course, there was also the National Housing Society, which built houses at the edges of the corporation scheme. Once you had all of these people moving into new houses, you needed to provide them with shops and other services. And the other thing that starts to happen is that the purpose of those big houses that we have seen, which stood in the landscape, they're going to change. So they're either going to be completely demolished and lost forever, like Rathmore, or they're going to be reused for different purposes. And that's, again, a common pattern that we see across Dublin during this time period. So Edenmore House, or Violet Hill, was redeveloped for use as St. Joseph's Hospital. Belmont, which is the bottom right-hand corner, which was where the windmill had been. That is redesigned for the Capuchins. We can see also the Shieling, which was previously Foxhall House and became Foxhall Hotel, and later the Shieling Hotel, and now apartments. And we can see Raheny House or Ballyhoy, which became a nursing home. In addition to providing shops and other services, very important was to provide for all of the children. And the Catholic Archdiocese was very conscious of the need to provide for such a huge new population. So the new secondary schools were underway in the early 1950s, although the buildings may have followed a little after. So we have a new secondary school for boys and for girls. And we also see a recognition that it wasn't just Raheny itself, but the parish area was much larger back then. So the parishes hadn't been divided up. So it was the entire area of Coolock, Colester and Raheny was one parish. And because of the number of houses that were being built by Dublin Corporation, as well as by private developers, it was anticipated that there would be a whole series of new churches and schools required. So it was going to be a vast building programme. The new schools in Raheny, it ended up being 3 new national schools with a capacity for 1,400 pupils. So that's Scoláine, Scoléine and Scolida. But the new, the Springdale National School, the former parochial school, also moved in the 60s to, so a little bit later, to a bigger and more modern building. And we mentioned already the new Gael School at Scoilnasson. So there's a huge amount of development required for the vast numbers of people who were coming to live in this area. So if we look at the map, so this is only a few years on from our previous map, but we can see already the impact of development. So the blue circle around the so-called Coolock Raheny scheme, which is Mask houses. We have Ennifert, the purple. We have the St. Anne's Estate in red. We have St. Aston's and Foxfield in the darker red. So huge amount of new development undertaken. Indeed, the Catholic Church reckoned that the Roman Catholic population had grown fourfold to 10,000 people, which required the building of the 4th and final church in Raheny. So here we can see the blessing of the foundation stone in 1960. So this is Our Lady Divine Grace under construction, with the previous 1864 church, the St. Aston's Roman Catholic Church, in the background. And that's how it looks in the present day. So the capacity of this new church is an indication of the huge increase in population. So 1,500 people could be accommodated at church services in this new church. So hugely, dramatically increased compared to the scale of the older churches in Raheny. If we look, our final map is from the late 1960s, and we can see the corporation developments at Eden Moor and the final phases of Foxfield, and also in purple, the development of Maywood and Betty Glen. Not marked, because it comes a little bit later, is the development along Grange Road in the direction of the fire station. So that's sort of the last development in the later 1960s. So here are some of the brand new houses at Edenmore, which were completed by G&T Crampton for Dublin Corporation in the early 60s, and some advertisements for Maywood. So you can see some changes in the style of housing as we get into the 1960s. And the last ones here are Grange Park Estate and Grange Road. Just to give an impression of the scale of change for the Raheny ward, as these are all based on the same physical locations, the same 347 acres of Raheny ward. Between 1936 and 1966. You can see sort of small amount of development in the 30s, 40s, and into the early 50s. But you can really see how the scale of development takes off in the period from 1951 to 1966. And of course, with that came the need for many new services. I've just shown a few on this image, including the youth club, the library, and St. Paul's swimming pool. But of course, there were many others. In addition to the new modern schools, we had a new modern Garda station, and we had lots of sports and recreational activities developing as well. This is a final overview of the area when you can see pretty much completely developed. So all of those areas that were empty on our first map of the sequence from the late 1940s have been filled in, with the exception of some green open space and parkland. So we've seen that for much of its existence, Raheny served agricultural purposes. It had residents of big houses who sometimes impacted on the landscape, like Samuel Dick or Sweetman or the Guinness family. And there were some major infrastructural developments, particularly the changes to the Howth Road and the railway, which had an impact on the landscape. But most of what we see around us today is from the 1950s onwards. So the picturesquely situated little village, which was described by Dalton in 1838, is still picturesque at its heart, but it has grown to be a mature suburb. And hopefully using this lens of geography has helped you to understand how it was shaped into what it is today. Thank you.